So I really admire the monarchical system, and I think that for whatever reason, the UK has done a wonderful job of maintaining that. And I think a very economically canny job too, because I know the economic analysis indicate that the royal family generates way more income than they spend. And everything they're associated with here is a major tourist attraction. It's this tradition that you have here, this monarchical tradition, is something that's tremendously attractive to people who don't have that. Canadians, for example, Americans, and because it's so theatrical and so unique. And then you had Queen Elizabeth, who, man, I mean, that's quite the woman there. How many, 13 prime ministers? And so you had someone around to intimidate all your prime ministers. That's a really good idea, and I'm sure she did a fine job of that, you know. You can imagine how useful it was psychologically, in some sense, for the prime minister who has monarchical temptations, in some sense, like Trump did, to have to go on a regular basis to this remarkable person who'd seen this immense span of political history and confess in some real sense, right? And to be subject to her cautious and wise judgment, because I think she was a woman who was traditional and cautious and wise in the highest degree. And there were scandals in her family, but like you have a family, if people knew what your family was doing, don't you think there'd be scandals? And so, but she was remarkably free of scandals over that entire period, and that's a hell of a thing to manage for 70 years. Well, so what will happen now? The most likely thing is that your monarchy will disintegrate like most of the other ones have. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm certainly not saying I want it to happen, but because that sort of thing is so hard to maintain, especially in the modern world, and because you need someone so remarkable to manage it, the probability that you'll get another one is relatively low. And so I wish your new king the best. That's for sure. But you know, maybe you'll get lucky, and maybe your monarch, and maybe with your support, will rise to the occasion, and your country and the rest of the British Commonwealth will recognize that what they have in the shared bonds that unite them based on English common law and the great democratic tradition that's so much a function of this country, and this country really in particular. I mean, you're the birthplace of both Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, India, these amazing countries, these free, democratic, productive, generous societies. It's quite the accomplishment. And I see in England and in Europe, but in England too, in Great Britain, such apprehension about that, such refusal to note the greatness of your country and its contributions. I mean, you know, no one in the United States ever talks about the fact that the UK was the country that eradicated slavery. That only happened once in the whole history of the human race. You know, and your country did it. It took 175 years. You know, it was your country and the great people who were spearheading that movement at the time that established once and for all on the political and economic front that was not to be tolerated. And then, you know, it took a while for that idea to spread everywhere. It still hasn't, because there's plenty of slaves in the world. The estimate's 30 million at the moment, by the way. There are very few people who will come out forthrightly and say that it's right, that it's okay, that, you know, might makes right. And your country was definitely one of the moral forces in the world, the primary moral force on the political front, who established once and for all that was no longer acceptable. And yet, mostly what characterizes a fair bit of self-image in Great Britain is shame. And you know, every country has things to be ashamed of, but not every country also has things to be proud of. So what do we think? What's going to happen with the Commonwealth? Well, maybe we'll wise up and recognize that we have something absolutely precious to guard, and then maybe we'll guard it. But to do that, we're going to have to defend ourselves against unwarranted accusations of guilt. Not that there's not something to be guilty about, you know, because we're all the beneficiaries of the atrocities of history, and we have to atone for that in our personal behavior. But by the same token, man, you're supposed to separate the wheat from the chaff and not just call it all chaff. And when you look at your own history, you think, we stumbled plenty, you know, but we still walked uphill. And you, in your country, you can say that more than most.